Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. Also to those who are watching us virtually. My name is Eric Scissors. I'm a senior fellow here. We don't have a lot of time. We have really fun and important topics to discuss. I think the people on the stage need much introduction, so mine will be short. To my immediate right is Secretary Gina Raimondo. She's Secretary of Commerce, which puts her in a central position in, among other things, global semiconductor competition. Prior to this, she was governor of Rhode Island. Next on the stage, Chris Miller, my the geopolitical history of semiconductors. And on the at the end of the panel, because we may have to leave depending on how things go, Senator Todd Young, who has authored multiple pieces of legislation helping the U.S. in its competition with China, prior to being senior senator from Indiana. So I'd like to just jump in. Oh, I guess I'm going to be using a microphone now. Forgive me if I throw this at somebody. Secretary Raimondo, I'd like to start with you. Tomorrow is the first anniversary of Senate passage of CHIPS. The bill was motivated by national security concerns. Even so, it's going to affect hundreds of American businesses and thousands of American workers. There are people, perhaps in this audience, who wonder if it's a precedent for broader economic policy. So there's a lot of ground to cover. What do you see from your vantage point as the most important recent developments with regard to the CHIPS and Science Act?
Yeah. First of all, thank you for having me. And secondly, thank you for the work that AEI does. All of these issues, CHIPS, competitiveness, China strategy, are hard. And so appreciate all that you do and appreciate the dialogue. Also want to say, since tomorrow is the anniversary, I guess I had lost track of that, it really wouldn't have happened without the guy at the very end of this panel. Senator Young was a dog on a bone with that piece of legislation in all the best ways, and really, truly would not have happened without your leadership, so I have to thank you for that. Is it, as you say, is this a precedent? You know, let me say this. This is a unique piece of legislation insofar as it should be narrowly tailored and implemented to meet our national security imperatives. This is a national security investment, and that's our job. So will there be other pieces of legislation that are similar? I don't know, maybe. You know, we'll work with Congress to figure that out. But do I think that this is like ushering in a new era of, you know, broad-scale industrial policy? No, that's not what this is. This is, we have a massive national security vulnerability because of our dependence on Asia, Taiwan principally, for a critical piece of equipment, and we're going to change that and make America stronger. To answer your other question, what have we done since the past year? I have over 100 people who work for me now on the CHIPS team, top-notch people. We put out a vision paper in April, crystal clear about what are the national security goals we have to achieve. We today just announced a MOU that we've signed with the Department of Defense to make sure we work hand in glove. We hit the national security mission, and we've received over 400 applications, which is kind of amazing to me. 400 applications for companies in the supply chain and that make chips that want to participate. So at the moment I'm popular. I'm going to be very unpopular when I start saying no because we can't fund all 400. But, you know, short thing, we're up and running. It's amazing. All over the world, they've taken notice, and we have 400 applications.
Can I just follow up really briefly on that? I mean, a year ago was impossible to say. Now we're a year in, it still may be impossible. When do you think we're going to see, like, you know, you have applications. When do you think we're going to see a real activity has picked up a lot, but we're going to, you know, people are going to look around and say, wow, there's been a transformation of the American semiconductor industry. You know, we can see it on the ground.
Honestly, I think you're already seeing it. You're already seeing it. Since we announced the passage of the bill, there's been hundreds of billions of dollars of private sector investment in expansions in the United States. Samsung, Micron, Intel, already announcing. They were holding back, waiting for CHIPS to pass. And so you're already seeing it. You're seeing, I was just talking to the president of a major university. Actually, I've been out to Purdue a couple of times. Universities are creating new master's degree programs in semiconductor engineering. See community colleges creating semiconductor technician initiatives. So it's already happening.
Thank you. Senator Young, I want to turn to you. Whenever there's implementation of a major piece of legislation, there are challenges on the ground, there are changes that occur over time, that's unavoidable. The Secretary has given us her perspective. I'd like to hear you give your perspective, and if possible, the perspective from the Hill, if you're aware of what some of your college thinks. How do you see CHIPS implementation going a year in, and where are your priorities in terms of, I want to make sure we do this going forward?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I of course want to thank am I on? Okay. Want to thank AEI for holding this forum, and of course to be with Secretary Raimondo, who's doing, I'll say, to answer that question, excellent work in implementing this very challenging law. And Chris, your scholarship is second to none as it relates to this, and has informed a lot of our work in terms of oversight and so forth on the Hill. So thank you. The CHIPS Program Office has been responsive to members of Congress, allowing us to have visibility into all that's going on. We've unlocked a couple $100 billion of private capital in the wake of this investment to reshore semiconductor production in this country. Have there been some friction points along the way? Yes, but they've been minor in the grand scheme of things. It's really been remarkable how much activity has occurred in a short period of time from our higher ed institutions, which in the end, they're gonna have to produce the workforce to work at these fabs, to do the R&D and so forth. That has been encouraging. We've seen not-for-profit entities focused on R&D moving from Europe, finding a presence in the industrial Midwest with IMET, for example. We're ready. We're ready to do this, and globally, our diplomats are hard at work combining, coordinating a lot of their activities with our closest allies and partners in Europe and in the Asia Pacific. All those things are really important. I think I'm sort of looking not just at the implementation itself, but making sure that we properly resource some other important pieces of the CHIPS and Science Act. One being the research piece, $200 billion authorization for investment in certain areas of frontier technologies, from autonomous systems to artificial intelligence to quantum computing. These are the technologies that will no doubt play a really important role as we head more deeply into the 21st century. But they're essential to military effectiveness, hopefully avoiding conflicts as opposed to just winning them. We have to be prepared to do that. So we need to make those investments, and in this atmosphere, it can be difficult to make the argument for investments. We also need to resource the Tech Hubs program, which aims to sort of democratize and plant the seeds of the next oases of innovation across the country. That is, those that haven't had the benefit of significant federal weight of investment in the future, whether it's through research universities or DOE labs or the military as customer. Think Silicon Valley, Boston, North Carolina Research Triangle, Austin. I can't think of many others. And it's not for lack of having the infrastructure or the talent across, say, the industrial Midwest. So we're in the process with Secretary Raimondo's leadership of standing up the Tech Hub program. We need to make sure moving forward it has the resources to be effective.
Let me ask a quick follow-up. You said that there's good cooperation, in your view, between the Hill and the executive branch. Is there good cooperation between the Hill and the Hill? Do you feel like you have a consensus there that, obviously, again, we're going to discover things as we go along. That's unavoidable. So I'm not talking about everyone will agree on everything for the next 5 years, but do you think you have a consensus to stick with some of the programs you're talking about?
Anytime we've ever had a consensus on the Hill, they've been wrong. That means not enough hard questions are being asked, right? I just want to win the argument. I want to win the big votes. We've done that with respect to chips and science. We need to put ourselves in a position to do that when it comes to appropriations, and if not this year, in coming years. And I think that argument is ongoing. You've helped us here at this great think tank make that argument on numerous occasions, so I thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. All right, Chris, we've been talking about the U.S. With very good reason, because there's a lot to talk about in the U.S., but obviously there's an international component. Both the Secretary and the Senator have mentioned it. With chips, our actions would be much more effective if we could coordinate properly with our friends and allies. Of course, it's easy to say that. It's hard to do it, especially when some of our friends and allies seem to think that making money is their job and their national security is our job. What would you say is your best path to sustain cooperation and coordination with our friends and allies? It's not going to be perfect. We're going to have to wander off the path sometimes, but where would you take us to try to make the CHIPS program more effective internationally?
I think the first thing to say is to put the CHIPS program, which is an investment program in the U.S., next to a simultaneous program, the export controls, which have been separate but deeply related. And they've impacted almost every company in the semiconductor supply chain. And what makes this industry particularly challenging to control and to shape is that so many countries are involved, from the Netherlands to the U.S. to Japan, Korea, Taiwan, all across Southeast Asia. And so the process of getting coalitions together has been fundamental from day one. I think if you zoom out and look at the progress that's been made on coalition building, I'm actually surprised by the success rather than being disappointed by the disappointments. I think if you zoom back 5 years ago, in 2018, ask anyone in this room, would it have been possible to have established an export control regime bringing together countries from Europe and Asia? Most people would have bet against it, I think. And simultaneously, would it be possible to be setting up R&D partnerships between the US and Japan, US and European countries, US and Taiwan that are supported by the CHIPS Act? I think is also something that people would have said sounds unlikely at the level of depth that we have today. So there's no doubt going to be lots of tough questions asked about the specific balances that are being struck, and I think the U.S. has to make sure it's finding the right approach to make sure that allies and partners are doing their fair share of implementing controls and not leaving the burden entirely in the U.S. But I guess I'm struck by the extent to which there has been alignment, driven partly by U.S. diplomacy doing a good job, but also partly by other countries adopting similar estimations as we are about A, the importance of semiconductors, and B, the challenge that China poses to the industry.
Everybody's being so optimistic. It really, I find it slightly disturbing. So Chris, in particular, yes, other countries are really emphasizing semiconductors. Yay, we all agree, but of course, we all want some of the same things. We want resilience in our supply chains, in our production here. We want to make some money out of this, so it's not just governments pouring money in and there's no money to be made on the other side, and therefore it's a drain on the taxpayer. Don't you think that the emphasis on the wise emphasis on semiconductors here and elsewhere is going to set us up on something of a collision course?
I think in certain industry subsegments, I do have some concerns, but I guess when I look at it broadly, it seems like actually we're investing in places that actually align well with where our allies are investing. So we're investing in leading edge in particular, where US firms play a really big role in producing leading edge semiconductors. A lot of our allies are investing more at lagging edge, which plays to their industrial strengths, plays to their position in the market. And if you look at the investments that are actually going to risk overcapacity, it's not ours or Europe's or Japan's, it's China's. And that's actually a place where there's, again, a lot of alignment between all of the other countries that are trying to address this issue.
May I say
Sure.
something to that? I'm glad you said that. The amount of money that China is pouring into subsidizing what will be an excess capacity of mature chips and legacy chips, that's a problem that we need to be thinking about and working with our allies to get ahead of. Now, of course, you're right. Everything we're saying is easy to say and hard to do, so there will be tensions. But at least from where I sit, trying to implement this, we are working well with Europe. We are working well with Korea and Japan. And what we have to do is like what Chris said, which is, Japan has some of the most amazing chemical companies in the semiconductor supply chain. They ought to benefit, from this. We can't make, mine, design, package, and test everything in America. We can't. So we have to be strategic, make sure we have enough leading edge here, including leading edge packaging. But if we do it right, Korea, Japan, Europe can also benefit, and we'll have a more secure, resilient supply chain. And we all have to keep our eye on the ball of China.
Thank you for extending that remark, because it's a very important issue that I think may get a little bit underplayed, and I'm going to pose it to you, Senator. The high-end chip seems to be like the thing we need for national security. We don't want a potential rival to have better semiconductors than we do. We don't have to go into detail of that. That suggests that they're going to have better AI than we will, and so on. But as Secretary and Chris have just said, the low-end chip is where the Chinese are definitely coming to the world. First, they're going to substitute out, foreign sales to China, and then they're going to try to substitute out sales in other markets outside of China. How do you have a short-term versus a long-term priority? We can do both. We have to emphasize one. How do you see this strategically? There's a high-end challenge and a low-end challenge. They're both important. It's not that easy to address both of them, and I know that because I've talked to your staff about it, and
It's hard.
It's hard.
They are two challenges, and I think it's fair to sort of distinguish them. One challenge, the low-end challenge, leads to an idling of auto assembly plants in the state of Indiana when we have global pandemics, or God forbid in the future, a geopolitical event that interrupts our supply chain. So that's one of probably millions of examples of how a modern market economy can't properly function and grow in order to do, among other things, resource its military, but just to enjoy our standard of living. So that's the economic security dimension to it, which has a nexus with national security. The other is, do we have the right chips? Can we make chips domestically that are secure and have the capacity to work in, say, our nuclear missile submarines and our radar systems and all these sorts of military platforms that are needed to avoid wars, win wars if necessary. The two are linked together in terms of a business model. Chris writes about this in his book, right? You need to sell a bunch of the legacy chips in order to plow that revenue into R&D to make the really high-end chips that are needed for military purposes. Moreover, I would argue we need to get back into making more things in this country. In the 1990s, there was a popular adage circulated quite a bit in this town, which was, computer chips, potato chips, what's the difference? It's a really important difference. We found out pretty recently, we've been mugged by reality. There's an important difference, so we need to make these distinctions because there's not a ready substitute for semiconductors, and it's important to our national security. In China, let's not get complacent. We hear all sorts of commentary, I think much of it accurate, about their economic infirmities and their prospects moving forward. But in the near term, we've seen a really aggressive growth in their semiconductor sector over the last 5 years. Fourfold, they've increased their production. They now comprise about 20% of the production, and they aim, with all their US-trained postdocs, to move up the value chain in short order. So that's how I see the relationship between those.
Thank you. Secretary Raimondo, another question for you, and it's an obvious one. Chips and science is the big action in this space, but I think there's a good argument that the second biggest action in this space was the October of last year interim rule on export controls for semiconductors with temporary licenses for several firms. What's the timetable for the final rule and the license renewals? And if you don't want to address a timetable, can you tell us what the main factors are being considered in perhaps modifying the interim rule or issuing new licenses?
Yeah. So no update. There is no timetable insofar as I'm telling the team you got to get it right. So the timetable is as fast as we can and make sure it's correct. Once again, this is all about national security, and I want to be clear about this. This isn't about, holding China back or denying them commodity technology. Certainly not about denying U.S. companies revenue. It's about being honest about the fact that China has a military-civil fusion strategy, which includes getting our most sophisticated technology and using it to advance their military, and we're not going to allow that. Or we're going to do everything within our power to not allow that. So we are right now engaging heavily with industry to try to figure out, this is hard. I would just say, I'm not asking for sympathy, I'm just saying this is very hard, because what we want to do is be incredibly targeted. You don't want to control anything that you don't have to control, because it denies U.S. companies revenue that they can plow into R&D. On the other hand, you don't want to let anything through the gates that you need to control. So we are getting into and AI is a huge piece of this. You mentioned AI briefly. We're ahead of the world in AI. That's a great thing, and we want to stay there. We are a global leader in AI, and we want to stay the global leader in AI. So, long-winded way of saying, how do we do it? It's with the national security lens, to be targeted, but getting into the weeds of the technology, engaging with industry, engaging with technical experts in academia and elsewhere to figure out, where do we draw the line to protect America and American national security?
Senator Young, I sort of want to follow up on that with you. The Secretary, I think most of the people in this room do see this as a national security issue.
Yeah.
But there are some people who don't see it as a national security issue. They see it as a money issue.
Yes.
And whenever, you mentioned this before, whenever there's a consensus, you have to question the consensus. Well, there's supposedly a bipartisan consensus on China. I think there isn't a partisanship problem on China. I think this stage is part of evidence of that. But I don't think there's a consensus, because some people don't see China as a national security issue. They see it as a business opportunity, or conceivably a business threat. I just wonder, how do you see this? I mean, it's obviously both. I mentioned that at the outset. We can all see that. Mm-hmm. But there are some Republicans, as you know, who would say, "Hey, federal government intervention in the economy not justified." And the answer is, well, it's justified when there's a national security issue. But then some of the people receiving the benefits say, "This is not a national security issue. It's a commercial issue. I want your subsidies, and I want to be able to do whatever I want." Where do you see the balance being struck here?
We thought, Senator Schumer and I had a lot of conversations about this as we drafted the CHIPS and Science Act, and we narrowed the focus of the legislation to include only those things that I regarded as having the strongest national security nexus. So we have historically made generous and significant investments in certain areas of R&D, including applied R&D, not just curiosity-driven research, and that's paid dividends. Those sorts of strategic bets have been beneficial to our national security apparatus, and as a byproduct, we've seen some of those innovations harnessed by the private sector, but only as a byproduct. We focused on semiconductor production with sort of the same mindset. Jobs will be produced. We should celebrate those jobs. We shouldn't apologize for those jobs. We certainly shouldn't apologize that some of those jobs may be located in places like Indiana that I feel like have been somewhat neglected in past years. But we made the investment for national security purposes. And if we just keep coming back to that, as the Secretary has, I think it'll keep us disciplined at a time when there is some loose talk about government's ability to stand up and reconstitute entire industries. We need to show some humility and respect the power of markets.
Thank you. I do want to get to questions, and we're very pressed for time. But Chris, I'm imposed on you. Be brief. Manufacturing more in the US and supply chain resilience are not the same thing, and people confuse them all the time. You could actually get in a situation where you're manufacturing more and your supply chain is more vulnerable because you need more inputs that are coming from perhaps unreliable suppliers. We're going to manufacture more chips in the United States. I'm very confident of that, as we've heard. Where do you think the biggest supply chain challenge is for us, right? You're, from the whole chain, you're starting from research, you're ending with packaging. Where do you think the biggest supply chain resilience challenge is?
I would say two things. One, we've spoken about China's increasing capacity to produce lower-end chips. I think we've only begun to scratch the surface of the security implications of that. We spent the last decade understanding cybersecurity vulnerabilities, and we have a lot of them. We've put almost no effort into hardware security vulnerabilities. That's a big issue. The second is if you look at where devices are assembled, phones, PCs, servers, it's focused right now on China. It's the biggest assembler by far. That's beginning to shift. Companies are looking elsewhere, Vietnam, India, Mexico, but that's a slow process, and there's probably a lot more I think we can do to help companies identify alternative markets in a cost-efficient manner that lets them mitigate some of those vulnerabilities.
Thank you, and thanks for the brevity of the answer, because we don't have that much time left. Senator Young has to leave. Secretary Raimondo has like 45 things on her schedule. I would like questions from the audience. Okay, let's see. How am I going to do this systematically? I'm not going to be able to do it systematically. Please, sorry, it's going to be you, but please identify your name and your organization, and please keep your questions short. Don't imitate me. Short question. You'll be next.
Hi, Peter Sun with Kaplan Intelligence Group. Last week, Senator Warner, Mark Warner, the head of the chairman of the Intelligence Committee, said that, he just doubts a full-scale invasion of Taiwan, but he said it could be possible, more possible, a 2-weekend blockade like we did in Cuba. How badly would that impact the world, the U.S. economy? And also, how do you see this relating to the war in Ukraine and the importance of an unambiguous victory for the Ukrainians? Because a lot of people see the chips and the Chinese-Russian involvement as part and parcel of the war in Ukraine. Thank you.
One, please, yes, please pass the microphone to her. And two, anyone who wants to answer, just answer one part of the question. The gentleman asked a very broad question, so pick whatever part you would like, if anyone wants to answer.
The only thing I'll say is I don't know. He's the head of the Intelligence Committee, so I'll defer to him. Without saying the probability of a Taiwan episode or the precise timing or form of it, the important thing is, we want to be prepared for all eventualities. A risk of that kind, whatever probability it is, it's a big, huge problem, the answer to your question. So let's be ready.
Ma'am, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Paula Stern. I used to chair the US International Trade Commission, have 3 degrees from the Fletcher School. I'm representing today the National Center for Women and Information Technology. And we talked about workforce. And we know, if you look at the statistics, that the number of women in information technology, in computer science, the percentage is at the same level it was when the National Science Foundation started us about 20 years ago. We're still at 24%. Workforce, we see TSMC already saying that they may be lagging.
I'm sorry, ma'am, can you ask a question?
My question is, what we should be doing differently in the next 4 or 5 years than we haven't done, particularly at the corporate level, to retain those gals who have been increasingly trained, but who do drop out for various cultural reasons.
Mind if I take
Sure.
that? So, thank you.
You've been bringing this up.
Yeah.
At various stops too.
Yeah.
I'll say that.
Yeah, I'll take that question. First of all, you're exactly right. And let me just say this, guys. If we're successful in implementing chips, and let's hope we are, we will create 500,000 jobs in this industry, in this country in the coming years. If we don't figure out a way to get women trained and in those jobs, we will not be successful. We can build the buildings, we can do this stuff. We need a talented, skilled workforce, and to do that, we need women, boys and girls in high school and such doing this. So what do we have to do? Start in high schools, get the companies to do the outreach, be more creative about apprenticeship programs. I referenced Purdue earlier. The senator and I have spent time out there. Purdue, Arizona State, lots of community colleges are coming up with new training programs. And also, we're saying to them, go after the girls and the women, train them. And what we're saying to the companies, before any of these companies get a dime of taxpayer money, we ask them to show us their workforce plan. And people have said to me, why are you doing that? Why do you want to know? How are they going to recruit and retain women? How are they thinking about childcare? How are they doing workforce? I want to know because I'm a steward of taxpayer money, and they won't be successful unless they have the talent. So I'll keep it at that. We're out of time, but you put your finger on an important issue. It goes to competitiveness. It's not a social issue. We need to be successful to compete. Thank you.
The gentleman in the back, right there. Yep. Yes.
Hi, good afternoon. Patrick Wilson from MediaTek. Great to see you, Madam Secretary. Thanks for calling attention to these issues. MediaTek is a large Taiwanese company investing in the U.S. in places like Indiana. But my question is, ma'am, last week, the House Select Committee on CCP did a hearing on the Biden administration China policy, and one of the issues that came up is this persistent issue about some proposed regulations on U.S.-China trade, but particularly the semiconductor industry, are being delayed, long anticipated regulations. And I wondered if you had a chance to maybe address that question about what's causing the delay. And for business, this is a lot of uncertainty about these changes in policy. So we're anxious to get some certainty.
I don't think there's been a delay. You know, I know there's been lots of rumors and sort of rumors reported on. We're just doing our job. So there was nothing to be announced, and if we decide to make any changes, we'll do that in due course.
One more question. Gentleman over here.
Hi, Brendan Bordelon with Politico. Is it okay if I grab this? Or, okay. Hi. I got a question for the Secretary, actually. You met last week with the CEOs of Intel, Qualcomm, and NVIDIA, I think in part on export controls. Intel CEO Pat Gelsinger spoke at the Aspen Security Forum on Wednesday, and he said the message that he gave to you and some other Biden administration officials is, these new export controls coming down the pike, China represents 25 to 30% of the global semiconductor market. If you're cutting that out, we might have to invest 25, 30% less in fabs, domestic produced fabs, foundries, obviously R&D. What was your response to the message from those CEOs? And generally, how do you approach the idea, the notion that the export controls on chips and the goals of the CHIPS Act are potentially at cross purposes? How do you sort of square that circle? So the message to the CEOs and then the broader sort of issue that Gelsinger was raising, this idea that if you...
Okay. Either one.
I get the question. I don't see an inconsistency. Let's take it back to what we're trying to do. National security, protect ourselves. As I said before, there are certain technologies where the United States is ahead of China and other countries. China's been clear that if they were able to get this technology, including certain advanced AI chips, they could use it in their military against us. It may be that American companies can make money doing that. We're not going to allow that. It's bad. It's the point you were making before. So it's not good for America or any American company if we allow our most sophisticated technology, in some cases that only we make, get into the hands of the PRC and their military. But I don't want to have the cut line be so broad. It's hard to do this in a second. It's also why we have to work with our allies, right? You don't want the cut line to be so broad that you deny American companies revenue and China can get the product elsewhere, or China can get the product from our other countries. So what we're trying to do is be narrowly defined, work with our allies around these choke point technologies, which will deny some revenue to American companies, but we think it's worth it. But that's, to be very candid, that's why I meet with these companies. That's why we meet with technical experts in these companies to get to the right place so we don't damage American business, but quite frankly, we protect American national security.
Senator Young, I know you wanted to say something. Then we'll be wrapped, and I'd ask everyone to hold their seats for a second because we're going to allow the Secretary and the Senator to leave. Senator Young?
Just a 10-second addition to that. You can't presuppose, and not that you were, that there wasn't a belief that that export controls were needed at the time we passed and signed into law CHIPS and science either. We expected export controls were going to be necessary. So we factored that into the investments we made.
Yeah, that's a good point.
All right, again, we're at 2:41. Secretary and the Senator are going to leave. Please wait for them to leave. Even better, please wait for a panel afterwards where I get to answer all those questions and give my own opinion.
Left the room. No, right side. Just kidding. With us, we have three very distinguished experts on semiconductor and tech issues writ large. Emily Weinstein is with CSET, an organization that has done extraordinary work on emerging technologies, and she's written very widely on semiconductor issues and much else, so delighted to have you here. Thank you. Derek, everyone knows well at this point, but now will be transformed from moderator into commentator, so we'll see how his personality changes over the next 45 minutes. And then finally, Rob Atkinson, an expert both on technology, but also more broadly its implications for economic growth, and a writer who's studied both contemporary policy, but also put it in a historical perspective. So I'd love to draw out some of that, Rob, if we can. But perhaps picking up on where the conversation ended up in our first half an hour, we talked both about the promote side, but also the protect side, if you will. And I'd like to dive into a bit more of the protect to begin, since that's where there is a lot of debate in this town, and probably also in this room, about what the right boundaries should be. We didn't have a chance to talk about the potential new set of controls which have been discussed in the media on cloud computing and new AI semiconductors. So perhaps we could start with that, Emily, and get your thoughts both on what's been rumored, the implications of it, and whether that is a good idea or whether it pushes too far, threatens some of the businesses that we were referencing in the prior panel.
Sure, I'd be happy to address some of the rumors as best I can. We've heard that, as Derek mentioned and as was alluded to in the previous panel, that the October 7th rule is an interim rule. We are still waiting for a final rule. And in the process of assessing kind of where we stand now, there have been rumors that have come out about perhaps closing some gaps that might have been discovered between October 7th and now. And one of them does have to relate to cloud computing. Because as it stands right now, it is completely legal for a Chinese actor to access a controlled chip. So for instance, an NVIDIA A100 via cloud service providers, anyone from AWS to Google Cloud to Microsoft Azure, any of these companies, not just US companies, still completely legal. And I won't go too much into the kind of legal weeds on that, but this is just one of the kind of many things that I think the Commerce Department and other parts of the administration are trying to address now is how do we make sure that if our objective is to make sure that Chinese entities don't have access to this advanced compute, that we are effectively closing that gap as best we can. I think there are pros and cons to maybe going down this rabbit hole. I think, it does fit in line with the October 7th rules. If your objective is to prevent Chinese entities from accessing these advanced chips, you would want to also make sure that they can't rent those chips, via cloud service providers. But the problem is that opens up a whole new set of risks associated with the competitiveness of a now adjacent US tech industry. We've talked a lot about the competitiveness of the semiconductor industry and the semiconductor manufacturing industry. But the second we kind of go and expand this, we're now talking about the cloud industry as well. So a lot more implications, a lot more to think about. So a lot to watch for. And, I think the rumors had said that we could hear something as early as July. And I think we're slowly running out of time in July, so might have to look to August. But jury's out until then.
Well, Derek, could I bring you in on a different export control debate, which was obliquely referenced in the previous discussion, but perhaps we can get you to tackle head on, which is the issuance of licenses to firms that are buying manufacturing equipment and then importing them into China. Can you walk us through the pros and cons, I guess, of tightening those rules? And we talked in the prior panel about the role of allies, and so reflect, if you can, on allies' role here.
So quickly, just to summarize, interim rule in October. The interim rule can be changed, so the situation can be different than we think it is. But for the interim rule, we gave out at least three general licenses. They're called temporary general licenses. We'll see how temporary they are, to 3 foreign companies. Now, there's an interesting question about why you're handing out licenses to foreign companies and not American companies, but the foreign companies had a different business profile in China, so there was some justification. And the argument was, as usually the case with temporary licenses, is you want to avoid unnecessary market disruption. Okay, we did that. You've had time, you've seen it. The pro for extending these licenses is unclear to me. I really don't see it. Now, if the final rule is different, that's a different story. So in the light of cloud computing, et cetera, if you're going to make a significant change to the interim rule, if you're going to change what the current US semiconductor and related export control profile looks like, then you may have a reason because, again, you're telling these companies there's new rules. You need time to adjust. But if we were to, for whatever reason, keep the interim rule exactly as is, it would really undermine the administration's position to extend the licenses again. You can't say we're controlling semiconductor exports to China except for the biggest semiconductor producer and the biggest company in terms of aggregate revenue that operates in the semiconductor space. So at that point, 1, the administration's logic falls apart. And 2, if I'm an American company, I'd say, what? Wait, we're giving foreigners another license? NVIDIA is the obvious example, and believe me, I'm not arguing on behalf of NVIDIA because I don't think there should be licenses at all, but that's the situation. it was reasonable to say, hey, this is an interim rule. We're going to try to avoid disrupting the market. When you finalize that rule, whenever that is, and I think Secretary Raimondo has a point, let's get this right rather than hurrying to meet some sort of deadline. But then you can't be giving out licenses again. They're not temporary at that point. They're giant holes. And just like anything else, if you have a rule and you create a giant hole, all it's going to do is shift the way the rule is broken. My answer is I don't really see a pro for extending the licenses unless the rule is significantly changed. And there are huge cons because it basically undermines the effort.
And when you think about the U.S. government is in conversations with the South Korean government, the Taiwanese government, I suspect the administration would respond by saying, well, there's difficult diplomatic balances to be struck. How would you address that issue?
Well, I think the Secretary and the Senator both made a strong case that this is an important national security issue. At some point, you have to say to your allies, it's an important national security issue. And actually, you agree. You're acting like it's an important national security issue to you. Then, the diplomatic balance has to be secondary. You were given an opportunity to adjust. We're listening. There's no way anyone can accuse the Biden administration of not consulting sufficiently with our allies. So we're listening to them. Maybe we change the final rule in response to that. But you can't say, here we have a rule that's really important to our national security, and at the same time saying, but we don't want to upset our allies so they get to keep doing whatever they want. I mean, either you need to tell the allies time's up, or you're really not treating this as an important national security issue. Those are the only two options.
And Rob, we heard both the Secretary and the Senator reference the importance of U.S. firms selling internationally, earning revenue, plowing that back into R&D, and I think no one denies the importance of that dynamic. There's also the alternative challenge of restricting where technology needs to be restricted. Are we striking the right balance? And I guess how would you know if we're striking the right balance on the protection and also the making sure we have market access where it's just civilian goods?
Yeah, so I've been on a boatload of panels with Derek over the years, and I know how I could just see his disappointment in his face in the last panel. Like, come on, man, let's have an argument. So I will have an argument. What I like to do.
Yeah.
All right. So we issued a little piece last Monday ago, basically making the argument that there's a set of industries that economists would term as high fixed cost, low marginal cost industries. In other words, to make the very first chip for a company, it's about $5.5 billion. You got to design the chip, you got to build a factory. So you only sell one, you got to sell that chip for about $6.5 billion. So thankfully, you don't sell just one, you sell a boatload. And the more boatloads you sell, the lower the cost of production is at the margin, and your higher your profits and money to go back into R&D. That is the semiconductor industry. It's also aerospace, software, drugs, and a bunch of others. And what I worry about, I wish I could say I knew the exact balance, because I don't know the exact balance. But what I worry about is that the government, USG, is not really thinking about that dynamic in what they're doing. There is nothing we can do, by the way, in my view, that is going to stop China from becoming a Korea on chips. Korea had no chips in the 70s, and now they're dominant in certain markets. Nothing we can do about that. It is going to happen. Now, I guess you could argue, well, for national security reasons, we don't want it to happen before they invade Taiwan, if they invade Taiwan. What I worry about with this entire debate is that, when the whole thing was going on, and we were working on trying to help pass chips and science, people kept saying, oh, industrial policy is here. And I was like, no. Defense policy is here. The CHIPS Act, at least the CHIPS part of the CHIPS Act, passed for only one reason, and that was defense. And you heard the Secretary say that. Now, the problem with that narrative, though, is that that means that everything we do has to be about defense. So if CHIPS was about defense, then export controls are about defense. And so you can do that, even if you mess up the American industry. That's why I hate the defense narrative. I think the biggest question we have to face, and Washington has to face, is a much more higher level question. Is what's the biggest threat to our country? Is it a narrow, and I don't mean to diminish this at all, is it a narrow in the sense of contextual defense issue? In other words, our weapons against their weapons, or it is a much broader dual-use industry competition? The reality is it's both, But when you deny the importance of the dual use issue, then the whole issue becomes, well, can we keep them from having a few technologies that they maybe can make some military things with? And you just don't, they don't conceive of the fact, you know, I have this little quip, you know, the whole issue is now is around decouple, de-risk, deny. And I would say what the Chinese aren't, they're into destroy. Okay, that's their strategy, destroy. They want to destroy Boeing. They want to destroy Intel. They want to destroy all the biotech companies in this world. That is their goal. What we're doing in Washington is we're saying, we're going to deal with this narrow military technology issue in Taiwan, and maybe we can address it. So actually, and sorry for going on, but the last important point here is, if you think about, I used to work for a governor, Secretary Raimondo was a governor. Every single governor, doesn't matter what party they are going out into the world and trying to convince companies to move to their state. Not barbershops, but car companies, semiconductor companies. And you know what they all do? They basically say, what do you need? They don't, by the way, also put in requirements for daycare centers. They just say, what do you need? The US still thinks of itself as the as the sort of seller here. We're not. Samsung has a choice. They don't have to come here. TSMC has a choice. SK Hynix has a choice. If we basically say to those companies, you can never invest another dollar in China, I don't know what they're going to do here. I could see them saying, fine, we'll just sell to you. We're not going to put a fab here. If that's the condition of us putting a fab here, we'll take the China market, because the China market is going to be much bigger and it's critical for our growth.
So here's where I'm going to disagree. I actually agreed with a lot of what Rob said, and I think I started to introduce this as a multidimensional problem in my first question to Secretary Raimondo. But they're not going to be able to. That's the big lie that is being sold by the semiconductor industry. They've got 3 years where they're going to be able to make a lot of money selling to the Chinese, and then they're going to be driven out by Chinese firms. Because the money is at the low end, right? That's where the money's made, and that's the Chinese are going to overbuild. They're in the process of overbuilding at the low end. We're going to switch from, oh my God, it's this huge market that we can sell into mostly by making in China, but also by exports. It's going to switch to, oh gosh, you know, we're not making nearly as much money in China. And then we're going to get to the next step, which is the Chinese are going to drive people out of third markets.
So first of all, two things, Derek. That's the question that nobody, I was really happy to see the Secretary allude to that, because not to tout our own, we issued a report last year saying we should revise what's called Section 337, there's Paula, which allows for 10-year exclusion orders on foreign products, particularly from China. I would never let a Chinese-produced semiconductor or chip of any kind, never in a million years would I let it be sold in the U.S.
Because none. You'd go for none.
Zero. I mean, maybe there's a company in China that hasn't had stolen intellectual property or mass subsidization, but I'd be hard-pressed. If they could prove that,
this industry.
Yeah, it's a null set. So I just wouldn't let them in. But Derek, to your point, if they're going to do this, then what the heck? Why are we so panicked about it? If they're actually going to take the market in 3 years, why bother with export controls? The reality is they're not going to take the market in 3 years. They might take the market in 20 years.
Yeah, so I'll stop. We really fundamentally disagree on that point, and that is behind how you view export controls to some extent.
But in some ways, Derek, you're actually more optimistic about China's technological progress.
It's not technological progress, it's manufacturing progress. I don't think China will be at the top of the technological food chain in 3 years at all. But I think they will sub out the mass consumption low-end chips. And what I worry about with our factories here is that we did not write chips and science in such a way, you said no Chinese chips here. We did not write chips and science in such a way to protect our supply chain, that we could have the Chinese barging into our supply chain. We are making the chips here, but we're dependent on China. So I'm not talking about them operating at the top. I'm talking about them becoming a low-end chip manufacturing powerhouse, stem to stern.
Well, and I think, could I just add
Please,
one
yes.
thing really quickly too? I think that point that Derek just made is a really interesting one, where we think about kind of what does the future of China's semiconductor industry look like? And I think the Secretary brought up a really interesting point about keeping track of where China is on legacy chips, and should we be worrying about them potentially flooding our markets or global markets with lower end chips that are still needed by everyone, for cars and for even some, I would say, lower end defense type technologies. But the other thing that I think I'm watching for too is China's attempts to blunt force their way to more innovative chip-type technologies that cause us in the US to freak out and think that our policies aren't working. Because I think what we've seen in the past, if we look at how China tries to innovate, they often will try to do these kind of blunt force maneuvers, like, we don't have access to this, we don't have access to this, but if we pull this together and kind of, square this circle, we can sort of get there. That's been part of their technology transfer apparatus for the past 2-3 decades. And I think what happens is a lot of the times in the United States, we see, oh, look, for instance, we saw SMIC, we see that now they've reached a 7 nanometer capacity with their chips. We're freaking out, oh my God, export controls don't work. They must have gotten EUV from ASML or things like that. And it actually came to light that no, they didn't have access to any EUV photolithography. They didn't have access to any of the kind of fancier high-end things that were controlled. What they had done was, like I said, blunt force their way into it. And it turned out that they actually weren't able to produce those 7 nanometer chips at scale. So in that case, that means that our policy was working. So all I will say is I think we tend to be very overly reactionary whenever we see China potentially making a breakthrough or doing anything like that. But to Derek's point too, I think they're going to stay probably more on the lower end legacy side of things.
Well, let me take that observation in the context of AI, because the types of chips that have faced the strictest controls are chips used to train AI systems. One of the arguments that's often made is, well, if you can't get the most advanced GPUs, Chinese firms, especially those working for defense applications, will just buy lots of low-end GPUs, string them together, and get the same training capability, maybe at slightly higher cost. Is that plausible? And if so, should we worry about it? What should we do about it? Can we do anything?
No, to me, I think that's a perfect description of what I think the future might look like. And to be honest, for me, export controls are not a tool that are, they're not designed to completely stop China from innovating in artificial intelligence. To me, if I'm looking at, assessing the effectiveness of US export control policy, I'm looking to see is, have we made it more expensive for China to innovate or make progress in AI? Have we made it, if it was going to take them 3 years and now it's going to take them 5, 6, 10 years? I think that to me is a well thought out policy. And obviously there are things that you can do to make sure that we're adjusting policies as we see those changes in the Chinese system. But to your point about, does this mean, so let's say China, the PLA is able to string a bunch of things together and have some type of new supercomputer that they're using to help, with battlefield plans or things like that. To me, it's probably inevitable that they will be trying to use some of this AI, even if it's kind of lower end or, like I said, blunt forced together. But the fact that we have potentially blocked access to the most advanced chips right now, to me is a positive sign, because again, we're imposing that cost, we're imposing that difficulty on the Chinese side. And I think, one of the arguments that I've heard against this is people often say, oh, well, the Chinese military is going to be so much worse because they're going to have to string together all these older and less advanced chips. And it's going to cause them all these, big issues with their systems and all of that. I don't necessarily think that's the case. I think what we have to watch for now is, again, if we see them trying to, I don't know, I worry more about like the interoperability side of things. If they're trying to build all these systems with lower end chips, how do they kind of work some of these things together? I think in certain cases, people underestimate how easy or actually how difficult it is to like plug an NVIDIA chip into a system that's built by someone else and kind of move all these things together. So I think there are ways for us to watch to see, where they're going with some of this, but I'll stop there.
I think we'll probably have some questions from the audience on AI, and I'd like to bring the audience in pretty soon, but maybe just to hone in a bit more on the low-end chip, or actually, I think low-end understates their importance. I like the phrase foundational chips, because they're foundational in everything.
The Bureau of Industry and Security does not like foundational as a term, and if you get that joke, you're a nerd like me.
So we've heard multiple predictions now of growing Chinese capacity in low-end chip making, of growing market share potentially. Rob has suggested regulations to allow zero Chinese-produced chips in U.S. markets. I think that's probably not politically feasible in the short run. Derek, if you're looking at the window of political feasibility, how would you start thinking about this challenge?
I, as one of the original proponents of partial decoupling, I have to thank my ally in encouraging political consensus in the U.S., Xi Jinping. I think I don't think the leopard changes, in this case, his spots. I think we're going to get more provocations from the Chinese. It's built into the way Xi Jinping apparently sees the world based on all of his behavior. So I think the political consensus is going to be there, even, hopefully, short of a serious event concerning Taiwan, because China's going to do a bunch of other things that provokes us and everyone else. Rebuilding Russia would be one possibility that jumps to my mind, because there are a lot of suspended Chinese projects in Russia at the moment. So I think we're going to have a consensus for a while. I think we will, of course, have industry lobbying, and this is one of the dangers if we don't follow Rob's zero policy, which is not that easy. It's not that easy to prevent transshipment. It's not that easy to, there are technical issues here. Does this count as the Chinese chip if it's 40% Chinese content, it's a Chinese firm, operating in Singapore, and it's mostly somebody else? All those questions to be answered. But I think, the risk here, of course, is American industries which use chips, right? That's what we're going to be told, like, oh, but, this is going to cost us money. And it's as if, and I already see this happening, it's as if people have forgotten the pandemic as a lesson. Why did you have shortages? Because you got too dependent on the Chinese. Now, maybe for the profitability of firms, that's okay. You made more money because you were dependent on the Chinese, then you had shortages, you were able to charge higher prices. But from the national interest, this is an easy one. So I think we'll probably, as long as we have this aggressive Chinese government, I think we will probably have enough consensus to keep large-scale Chinese computing and related sales down here. I think the issue will be more subtle. I think it will be compromising the supply chain in more subtle ways.
So, look, the reason we had the supply chain issues is because we were producing in China. And I don't think anybody on this panel, I assume, is saying we should encourage or even perhaps even allow much production in China. I'm not talking about that. We should be selling China a lot more stuff. That isn't a supply chain vulnerability. That's the opposite of that. We make them vulnerable to us. If you think about this entire China-US debate, it really boils down to one question. It's a ratio of who has more vulnerability, who can harm the other side the most. And to the extent that we still have sales they depend upon, we have that leverage. So I don't think you can dismiss the fact that selling in China, where 30–40% of the market, American companies cannot walk away from that and still be viable in the long term. That's point number one. Point number two, the military in Asia and China, they're not using 3 nanometer, 5 nanometer, 6 nanometer chips. I was talking to a company that was talking about 140 nanometer chips. They're certainly not using cutting edge. And I worry that this whole debate, let's just say we're all serious about this debate with defense of Taiwan, which I am. AI and the ability to do large language models is probably pretty low on my list. I think we should, if you're really serious about that, why isn't the Secretary and others saying, why isn't the Biden administration significantly ramping up the defense budget? We could be doing that. If you look at all of the things that the Chinese military needs to gain advantage, very few of them relate to chips, and even way fewer relate to AI. And what are we doing there? The reason we're not doing anything there is we don't have choke points there. So we don't have the ability to cut off 6-axis numerically controlled machine tools to China. We don't have the ability to cut off propellant rocket fuel to them. So I think we've sort of all just kind of hyper-focused, and now that we're on this massive AI panic where, Oppenheimer, supposed to see the movie, which I'll see with my wife, and the message of that is we need an AI test ban treaty now. Like, what? So I think we got to calm down. AI is not the most central thing that the Chinese military is going to have.
Can I add something really quickly on that too? I think there is a really interesting disconnect between the conversations happening about the national security risk of AI, or I should say it's being misconstrued to think that AI is only large language models. And I think because of that,
sure.
not just you, this is something that, I think I am not a technologist by training. I am a China analyst by training, so I have taken the past few years to try and study this. But this is something that happens a lot, where now I think there's this big, we're calling this an AI hype. It is a large language model hype. And there's a really interesting aspect of this where we argue that the US is leading in large language model development. I think that's pretty clear right now with OpenAI and Meta and all these other companies. There's also a debate to be had about whether or not it is in the interest of China to develop large language models for their society. I think there's an overexcitement to assume that if the US is leading in a specific technology that China also wants to lead, and I don't think that's necessarily always the case. But I think in other parts of AI, there are more national security or defense relevant applications. Think about computer vision, natural language processing, all these other subsectors of AI that in some cases China may actually have a lead on. And so I think actually getting down to the second layer of what is the AI that we're actually talking about can actually move us closer to what is the national security implication that we are worried about, and how can we craft effective policy to address that.
Emily just reminded me of something. There are some areas that China leads on, and I'm going to draw an analogy, and it's an imperfect analogy, and Rob can shoot it down, but he doesn't need to, because I agree that it's an imperfect analogy. So you already won this part of the debate. You don't even know what the debate is yet.
Cool.
Look, the Chinese also lead in electric vehicles, for example, not relevant to AI, but relevant to the industrial question. 10 years ago, I heard the same thing from automakers that I hear from chip companies now. We have to sell to China. We have to sell to China. And you could see what was coming at them, and I think they could see it too, but that's not what they said in public, certainly not what the Germans said in public. And now there are serious problems for American firms somewhat, but we're not the auto leader, mostly for the Germans, to some extent for the Japanese, who are better prepared. I see a very obvious example in computing where the Chinese are going to be better at us than some things, and they're going to drive that money that firms think they have to make in China, they can't survive without it. Well, then you're going to die because the Chinese, as you said, I don't put words in your mouth, I completely agree with, the Chinese will target foreign leaders for destruction. And the first thing is, we're going to drive you out of our own market. That is what's going to happen in at least parts of computing, the way it's happened in a whole bunch of other industries.
Well, I have a lot more questions, but I'd love to bring in the audience, because I'm sure there are many questions in the audience as well. Ben?
Sorry, hi, Shane Tusen here with the American Enterprise Institute. Following on that same point, Open Radio Access Network is another area where we're trying to do the same thing. Just wondering how you feel like we're doing that, because I realize it's ultimately software driven, but we need to make sure that we have a handle on where we're getting the hardware and trying to friendshore again away from China.
Let me grab one more question, then I'll turn it back to the panel. You have your hand up? Please.
Again?
Does snarky remark? Is that the same as a question?
As long as it ends with a question mark.
As long as it's a short, snarky remark.
With that in mind, I would say, Derek, I had a couple of objections to some of the points you made, but by the way, I'm a lobbyist for a chip company, so it's the missing Venn diagram here. But I was going to say that the thing that we missed in the Secretary's comments before was she actually said it's not happening. I don't know if you heard it differently than me, but she's like, why are you standing around waiting for regulations to come? We didn't say regulations were coming. And that's the way I heard it. So that's what I wanted to take objection to, is that she didn't say, oh, we're going to stop chip sales to Huawei. All those companies that have exclusive monopolies to sell to Huawei, two of the biggest American companies, no foreign companies, have licenses to sell logic to Huawei. That is going to continue, apparently. And we're not going to have the October 7th update. We're not going to, there's a whole list of things that are waiting to happen, including outbound investment restrictions, which Taiwan companies have and American companies don't. Anyway, I just wanted to make sure not to gloss over that. That's what I heard the Secretary say, which is, why are you waiting? Nothing's happening.
You want to take one or both of those, Rob?
Patrick, that goes to I think the complete lack of coherence to our national policy. We pick one firm that we don't like because of supposed cybersecurity risk, and then we say we're not going to sell you certain chips. Look, the reality is, if we don't think that Huawei is secure, and I'm happy to believe that, then we don't import their stuff, and it should be the end of the deal. There's no reason to kill them. If cybersecurity is the issue, you don't have to kill the firm, you just don't have to buy from the firm. And secondly, for us to do that, we are giving up sales to very little effect. If you look at Huawei market share in their equipment, the phone side, because they need really good chips, The phone, the base station side and the 5G side has been growing because they substituted us out.
Phone's up 40% this year.
Phone
Sales. The only vendor other than Apple that sales are up this year.
It's a base effect because they got creamed.
Huawei phones or their subsidiary they spun off? All right, so their phones are up, and certainly their equipment is up. So look, I go back to my core thing. You know, there's the Overton window, which everybody who works at a think tank knows what the Overton window is because what we all hope when we retire that we've had one Overton window success. And here's my one Overton window success. Overton window is widen the aperture to allow policies that are now seen as what the heck to, oh yeah, that was a great idea. And that should be, in my view, we have a trade law was put in place specifically to say if there's systematically unfair foreign competition, we can block them from our borders. The EU passed something sort of similar about 3 years ago, targeted at China. We should just have a rule that says if you're competing unfairly, you can't have access to our markets. If we did that tomorrow, we would do much, much more harm to the Chinese civil military fusion enterprise than the targeted controls we have. Much more harm, because they're doing all of that based upon import revenues they're getting, export revenues they're getting.
And I also want to comment on Huawei, which was a big theme there that, actually a word that didn't come up in our first panel, interestingly. Emily or Derek?
Oh, I mean, I don't know if Emily wants to take the Oran question. I don't think I know enough about it. With regard, I did not hear the secretary say that, so we heard differently. I would say that I am working with Commerce on issues about those decisions. That doesn't mean the decisions will get made. It certainly doesn't mean they'll get made in a timely fashion. That is not a strength of the Biden administration, making China-related decisions in a timely fashion. But I don't think I'm not sure you're right that there are no regulations coming. Going beyond that, there's a question of whether there should be regulations. And my answer to that again is I have no problem with either. Well, I have no problem with one of Rob's statements, which is if we cut off sales, certainly in strategic areas, again, that's not punishing the firm. They don't have a right to sell here, right? We're not trying to destroy it. That would have more effect than what we've done so far. So we agree on that. I just think, obviously there's going to be Chinese retaliation, right? So that's what's holding us back politically anyway, is that we think our sales in China are worth more than the harm that is done by unfair competition by Chinese selling here. And just as a point of fact, in case all of you aren't trade data nerds, our exports to China are about 1/3 of the sales of US affiliates in China. So the action for US companies in China is not generally exports. It's sales of their affiliates in China. The Chinese brought those companies there mostly for job creation. Now it's partly for control. But that's what we're talking about losing. And if we say you can't sell here, which may be justified, I'm not disagreeing with that, there's going to be retaliation. And the firms that are saying we need that revenue, well, they're going to lose the revenue. They'll lose it either directly by Chinese action or by Chinese retaliation.
The only thing I'll say really quickly about that example, I don't know specifically on the ORAN side of things, but I do know, so Chris made the point on the previous panel about cybersecurity and software, how over the past few decades we've become really good at identifying vulnerabilities there and are just, I think, starting to grapple with this issue on the hardware side. I think the converse is happening with export controls, or has been happening with export controls, where we think we've got a solid grasp on hardware-related export controls, because it's much easier to think about a tangible item. When it comes to software export controls, though, they've existed for decades. They are significantly harder to design and enforce. And I think that's one of the things that we're currently struggling with on chips and with artificial intelligence, where, okay, if AI is made up of data algorithms and hardware, we've kind of, we've doubled down on the hardware side of things. We're left with algorithms, which are, you could argue are software, and data, much of which exist in the open source, and much of which are, in some cases, substitutable. And so it's a lot harder to figure out how to navigate that. And I think there is a tendency to overreach and try to apply broad-based controls on these things because we don't necessarily know how to get it right. So I'm happy to hear that the secretary is at least allegedly holding off on things until we do get things right. But I think, yeah, it's going to be a lot more difficult. And I think we're almost maybe in an era potentially using export controls, not necessarily as things that are always enforceable, but maybe as a deterrent maneuver or mechanism.
I just wanted to talk about data. I know we're covering way too much ground here, but that's the way computing works now. There are a lot of different dimensions. The Chinese, as many of you may know, are in the process of implementing new data controls. And I think it's going to have an interesting effect on U.S. corporate disclosure for listed U.S. companies, because they're not going to be allowed to tell the truth. And yet they're going to be bragging about their profits that they made in China. The Chinese are still working this out. And I don't mean to say that if they have a data law, we should have a data law. I certainly don't think when the Chinese do something, we should copy them. But it would be nice if we thought about it and rejected it, or took, we decided we need data controls here and we don't need them everywhere else. So that's an area where the U.S., there are people talking about consideration. It doesn't seem like we've gotten to the point of really understanding. Everyone says data is the new oil. Well, we're not thinking about it as the new oil. We're just hyping it up as the new oil.
Let's grab some more questions from the audience. Sir?
Excuse me. Claude Barfield, AEI. This is really a stimulating discussion, and what I'm going to say is probably will be counted as an act of traitors. But I would urge the audience, having listened to this excellent discussion today, to also go back and listen to a discussion yesterday at the Peterson Institute with Larry Summers and Robert Zoellick and Adam Posen, which attacked directly these issues of industrial policy and came to some very different conclusions. It's not that they underestimated the security risk, but they were not hipped on China. And they also pointed out that the United States, if we go down, and I should say that the Secretary was very firm today that the CHIPS Act is only for semiconductors. But Jake Sullivan's speech and the speech from the U.S. Trade Representative see this as a model for 7, 8, 9, 10 supposedly fundamental technologies. So listening to the debate over the last 5 minutes, where we turned ourselves inside out, trying to decide how to respond in terms of protection, goes right back to the point that they were making, number one, which I'm sure certainly Rob would disagree with, that the United States ought not to be attempting to come back greatly in industrial and manufacturing, because we're going to move away from that anyway. And secondly, that once you begin to subsidize, you inevitably, as we are seeing now with this debate on export controls, the debate from the Inflation Reduction Act, you inevitably are going to be drawn into protection, because the Congress is going to say it's the American people's money, and we don't want somebody else handling it. So all I would argue is that I don't necessarily agree with everything yesterday, and I agree with a number of things today, but I would urge the audience to go back and listen to that, since it was just 24 hours old.
I'd like to, so what are the limits to, first off, is industrial policy the right framework for understanding the discussion we're having? I think there's a lot of people in this room who might question that phrase as being relevant, so I'd be interested to hear all our panelists on that. And then second, what are the limits to whatever it is we're talking about?
First of all, Claude, nice to see you. I've enjoyed working with you over the years. We disagree.
You get the answer at the end.
So if I had been on that panel, which they never would have invited me because I didn't fit the ideology litmus test to be on that panel, which is to be a...
He means the Peterson panel, by the way, right? Just
not
to be
this
clear.
panel.
Yeah, and not the Raimondo Young panel.
No,
right.
yeah, no, the Peterson panel, which is a, I mean, look, the head of the Peterson Institute said that manufacturing isn't worth doing anything because it's filled with white males. That's what he said. It isn't, by the way. If you look at the number of blacks and Hispanics in manufacturing are pretty much the same as their share in the rest of the economy. Why did he say that? Because he is allergic to anything other than total free trade. The reason I say it that way is I don't think, I'll give you an example. In the television industry, China now has 75% of the LTE market, the LCD market, 75%. And they didn't get it because they happened to be good. They got it because they subsidized the heck out of it. So what's left? You got OLED, and you got LG, and you got Samsung. They just built BOE, I think it was BOE, their big BOE. They just had a factory there, like 3, 4, something like that, $1 billion factory, where the government paid 88% of CapEx. Chips, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Patrick, here. I'm going to guess if the Feds go above 15 on CapEx, it'll be, there's no way, I don't think the Feds will go above 15 on CapEx. So why would I let that TV be imported here? That's point number one. Point number two is, to your point about 10 industrial policies, no, what Senator Young was talking about was the 10 strategic technologies that were identified in the science component of the act is NSF funding. It's science funding, it's university funding, and if we have to have an argument about whether that's okay, we're really off target. So I can see your argument if we had 10 more CHIPS Act, although actually I think we should have 5 more CHIPS Act, but we can have an argument about that, that's what I think. So, and then lastly, we just have to get over this free trade versus protectionism thing. It's not one or the other. When we're facing competitors who are predatory, I mean, I think Derek and I both agree, this is predation.
Yes.
I am not going to let, if it was up to me, I would not let them kill me. I just say, you can't kill me. Now, if I'm killed by the Germans or I'm killed by the Canadians, then all right, fine, I lost because I'm not doing very well and I deserve to die. But I don't deserve to die from somebody who walks up to me and puts a gun in my head. And I think that's the big difference we have to come to.
Right. And just to add to that, I got into a screaming match with some Trump administration trade officials in 2017 or 18, where they were equating the Germans and the Chinese because they both ran large current account surpluses. I'm like, if you can't tell the difference between a country that runs a large current account surplus because it has a highly competitive manufacturing sector, and one because it subsidizes everything to death, steals IP, targets firms to get rid of that are barriers to their taking market share.
Closes their own market.
It closes all of that, then you guys shouldn't be making trade policy. That was not well received. Look, the Chinese, there may be countries, because I am not an expert on the trade policy of every single country, there may be countries that are more, even more interventionist than China. But the size intervention combination of China is on a scale it's out here on the graph, and everybody else is out here. So one thing, as a purely economic matter, it is a different in-kind competition. But second, it happens to be a giant national security challenge as well. Like if it was just one or the other, and this is where we might disagree, if it was just one or the other, I'd say, all right, it's a national security challenge, but they're not economic cheaters.
No, we agree.
We have to deal. Oh, they're terrible economic cheaters, but it's not a national security risk. We just have to deal with this. Both, and Peterson is living in the 90s in general. They don't see, they're still living in a world where the US does not have a huge national security challenger who is not also a gigantic economic predator.
We've got 2 minutes left. Let me try to grab one more question
Totally
and then
agree.
we'll wrap up. Please.
Well, I'm Paula Stern, and I had thousands of cases before me at the ITC, hundreds under Section 337, which you referenced, as what I consider an opportunity, really, to answer some of this debate. And
But if we could have a quick question, please, since we have 2 minutes left.
I'd like Rob and Derek and Emily to give us their idea on how you would jigger Section 337 to deal with Chinese intellectual property that is coming into the United States, but which is using an IP, whether it's a design, a chip design, or an actual patent or a copyright, and make that into, if you will, the appropriate tool for the 21st century challenge to China. I mean, I think that would be a worthwhile discussion.
Can I give you the $20 later for asking that?
No, give it
Now?
to me now.
All right, in 30 seconds.
The short answer is we laid that out in a 10-step, very specific legislatable thing. It's on our website, itf.org, just put in Section 337. The quick answer is 2 things. One is get rid of the harm threshold, the damage threshold. There have been cases that companies have lost in 337, even though there was stolen IP, but they hadn't quite taken their market, even though they were taking the growth. That's number one. Number 2 is allow commerce to bring cases. Too many companies are afraid of retaliation. And I was talking to one company, it cost them $10 million to bring one case of manufacturing this. So there's a bunch of things we could do. It's super easy to do. It costs Congress nothing, well, almost nothing. So we should do it.
Ask really tiny addendum. We don't even track Chinese firms that we think have received stolen IP.
Exactly.
We don't track it. I've tried and tried and tried. Talked to the U.S. government. I mean, we track it on a case-by-case basis. Somebody says, yeah, but okay.
It's only with hindsight.
Right. Right. So we track it when it happens. We don't keep track of it. Of course, the companies change names. They spur new affiliates. We don't follow any of that. So, you know, we're starting in a world where there is evidence, and we don't gather it as a government. And it's too difficult and costly for a company to do it. It's exactly information provision, exactly what the U.S. government should do it.
All I'll say really quickly, and I'm going to zoom back out for a second because I think there's an interesting thing that you brought up that ties into a few things that we've been talking about too. And this may be my controversial take for the panel, but there's...
She says it at the end.
Yeah.
there's a really interesting case actually where the Chinese EV company or the battery company CATL or CATL it has entered into some type of joint venture or joint agreement or arrangement with Ford out in Michigan. And it's supposed to be this arrangement to license CATL technology to be able to work on batteries for electric vehicles. It's a little too early to say now, but to me, it is potentially a really interesting example of us taking the Chinese strategy and using it against them, where we are now taking their intellectual property, hopefully in a way with eyes wide open, where we are actually trying to make sure that we are protecting ourselves, where we're just licensing the IP, we're not bringing too many folks from CATL into the factories. We're doing it in a way where we can actually understanding that China has the lead on electric vehicles and on batteries, and we need to find a way to catch up. Let's try to do it in a way that let's try to turn what the Chinese have done to us for decades back on them and take some of this technology that we need to be able to better our society and just better compete with China in general. I don't know. I know people have very strong feelings about the CATL example, but I think, again, too early to tell, but I think it could be a really interesting precedent that we're setting here.
Well, that's a very strong provocation on which to end. So but we've already overrun our allotted time. So let me just thank once again the panelists for the conversation. Thank you.